It was past midnight when Pastor Elijah Cross first heard it. Not a sound exactly. More like a feeling. The kind that presses itself into the back of your skull and refuses to leave. He had just returned home after the longest spiritual battle of his ministry career. His shirt was still damp. His hands were still trembling. But as he stood in the hallway outside his son Daniel's bedroom, something made him stop. The door to his 8-year-old boy's room was slightly open, and through the crack, all he could see was darkness. He pushed it open slowly. Daniel was asleep. Still. Peaceful. Elijah exhaled. He told himself he was just tired. He told himself everything was fine. He told himself that because the alternative, what he had felt standing in that hallway, was something no father wanted to believe was possible. But here is what you need to understand about that night: what followed Elijah home was not finished. And it was patient. Before we go deeper into this story, we want to hear from you. Drop in the comments where you are watching from right now. We would genuinely love to know. And if you are new here, click that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Before we tell you what happened to Daniel, you need to understand who his father was. Because this story only makes sense if you understand the kind of man Elijah Cross had become, and more importantly, the kind of man he had quietly stopped being. Elijah grew up poor in rural Georgia, youngest of 5, raised by a mother who prayed out loud every morning beside the kitchen table while her children slept. He used to lie in bed and listen to her voice move through the walls. Something in those prayers got into him so deep he never shook it loose. By 23 he had planted a congregation out of a rented storefront in Atlanta. By 30, that storefront held over 1,000 members. And by 35, his name carried a specific weight that most pastors never earn. When people were broken in ways that medicine could not explain, when hospitals sent families home with no answers, when 5 other pastors had already walked away shaking their heads, they called Elijah Cross. He had never lost. Not once. And that unbroken record was the most dangerous thing about him, because somewhere inside a man who has never lost, a quiet voice begins to whisper that maybe he never will. He did not hear that voice yet. But it was already there. And something else was listening to it too. His wife, Amara, had married him before the fame. She was a quiet woman, steady in the way that still water is steady, not because nothing moves beneath it, but because it knows exactly how to hold itself. She taught 2nd grade at a public school 4 days a week and spent her evenings cooking, grading papers. They had 1 child together. A boy named Daniel. 8 years old. Gap-toothed smile. Obsessed with building things out of Lego bricks. He called his father, Daddy, in a way that made Elijah feel like the most important man alive, which, in Daniel's world, he was. To the world, Elijah was a warrior. To Daniel, he was just Daddy. The year Daniel turned 8 was the same year Elijah's ministry reached what many considered its peak. He was traveling more. Speaking at conferences. Being featured in Christian media. Amara noticed the shift before he did. He was present physically, but somewhere in the middle of all the victories, the man she had married had quietly started believing his own reputation. Not in a loud, arrogant way. In the slow, invisible way that pride works in good men. Like rust on iron. You do not notice it until the structure starts to weaken. The night that changed everything started with a phone call. A family from a small town 2 hours outside Atlanta had been dealing with something they could not explain for over 4 months. Their daughter, a woman in her late 20s named Rachel, had not slept through the night in weeks. She spoke in voices that were not hers. She knew things she had no way of knowing. 5 other pastors had attempted to help. Each one had left shaken. Elijah agreed to come. A pastor who documented one of his own encounters described sitting across from a young wife who screamed at her husband in a voice pitched an octave above her normal register, using words so poisonous and precise that it became clear something deeper than human psychology was at work. What Elijah walked into that night was something in that same territory, except more concentrated. The room smelled like metal. Rachel was seated in the corner of the living room when he arrived, knees pulled to her chest, rocking slowly. Her family stood near the walls, not close to her. When Elijah walked in, she went completely still. Then she looked up. And the thing looking out through her eyes was not Rachel. The session lasted 7 hours. 3 elders from Elijah's church were present, along with the family. At 2 points, everyone in the room was physically moved toward the walls by something no one could see. At the 4th hour, Rachel's voice dropped into a register no human throat should produce and said 5 words directly to Elijah. We know who you are. He held his ground. He prayed. He commanded. He did not stop. A pastor who experienced a similar encounter described the moment a demon faked deliverance, going limp and silent, only to recoil with a violent, evil-sounding laugh the moment he refused to be deceived. The demon had not left. It had only gone quiet. Elijah had seen that trick before. He was not fooled. He kept going. And just before dawn, the room went silent in a different way. A clean silence. Rachel collapsed, and when she woke up, she was herself again. Completely. Her mother wept. Her father fell to his knees. The elders erupted in prayer. Elijah stood in the center of it and felt something he had not expected to feel, not relief, but satisfaction. A kind of spiritual pride that he did not recognize as dangerous in that moment, because it wore the clothes of victory. He drove home as the sun was coming up. He did not call Amara ahead. He just unlocked the front door, walked down the hallway, and stopped outside Daniel's room. That was when he felt it. That pressing sensation behind his skull. He told himself it was exhaustion. He told himself everything was fine. He pushed open the door, saw his son sleeping peacefully, and went to bed. 3 weeks passed. On the surface, the Cross household looked exactly the way it always had. Amara made dinner every evening. Daniel came home from school and dropped his backpack by the door. Elijah preached on Sundays to a congregation that had no idea what their pastor had walked through 2 hours outside the city. But Amara noticed things. Small things first. Daniel stopped asking for his Lego bricks, which had lived on the corner of his desk in a blue plastic bin since his 6th birthday. He just stopped touching them. She told herself he was growing out of it. Then she noticed he had stopped laughing at the television. Not that he seemed sad exactly. More like he was watching it from somewhere far away, like the screen was in a different room than wherever his mind had gone. He started going to bed without being asked, which had never happened in 8 years of his life. She would check on him at 9 and find him already under the covers, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. "You okay, baby?" she would ask. He would look at her and say yes. But the yes sounded rehearsed. Like something that knew the right answer but did not feel it. She mentioned it to Elijah once. He said Daniel was probably just tired from school. Elijah believed that because it was easier to believe than the alternative. And because a man who casts out demons for other families is often the last person willing to see one circling his own. Then one morning, 11 days after that first quiet shift, Amara found Daniel standing at the kitchen sink at 2:47 in the morning, staring out the window at the dark backyard. When she touched his shoulder, he turned around slowly and said in a voice that was flat in a way she could not name, "Someone is standing outside." She looked past him through the glass. The yard was empty. She held him and walked him back to bed and told herself it was sleepwalking. Children sleepwalk. It means nothing. Then came the notebook. Daniel had never been a child who drew. He was a builder, a constructor, a boy who thought in 3 dimensions with his hands. So when Amara first noticed the composition notebook on his desk, she assumed it was from school. She picked it up one afternoon while he was in the bathroom and opened it to the first page. What she saw made her sit down on the edge of his bed. Not because it was grotesque. Because it was precise. Page after page of the same repeating geometric shapes, interlocking circles inside squares inside triangles, drawn with a steadiness of hand that no 8-year-old should have. And then, deeper into the notebook, the faces began. They had no eyes. Just smooth blank ovals where the eyes should be. Each face was slightly different in its proportions but identical in that one detail. No eyes. On the second to last filled page, one of the faces had a mouth drawn slightly open, and beneath it, in Daniel's handwriting but in letters far more controlled than his usual scrawl, were 4 words, "He comes at night." Amara sat on that bed for a long time. She closed the notebook carefully. She walked to the back of Daniel's closet and placed it under a folded blanket on the top shelf. Then she stood in the middle of that room and listened to the silence of the house around her. She did not tell Elijah. Not yet. Because she needed to find the words for what she felt, and the words had not come yet. All she had was the feeling. The specific, cold, undeniable feeling that whatever had followed her husband home from that house 2 hours outside Atlanta had not come for Elijah. It had come for the thing Elijah loved most. 6 weeks after the night Elijah drove home from Rachel's deliverance, Daniel woke up screaming. Not a nightmare scream. A scream that had intent behind it, sharp and sudden, like something startled. Elijah was out of bed before he was fully awake. He ran down the hall and threw open Daniel's door and found his son standing on his bed, back against the wall, pointing at the window. "He was here," Daniel said. "He said you owe him." Elijah looked at the window. Closed. Locked. The yard outside was dark and still. He sat on the edge of Daniel's bed and held his son until the boy fell back asleep. And then Elijah sat in the dark for a very long time. Because those words. "He said you owe him." Elijah had heard something like that before. At the end of Rachel's deliverance, just before the silence, a voice had said something he had not repeated to anyone. Not to his elders. Not to Amara. He had told himself it was a taunt. That it meant nothing. He had not prayed over himself after that night. He had not been spiritually evaluated. He had gone home and gone to sleep. One account of a pastor who encountered a spirit that invaded his life described how it began slowly, harassing his sleep and affecting his family relationships, separating him from those he loved before eventually destroying his ministry entirely. Depression clung to him in a merciless way. Elijah was beginning to understand how that happened. Not through a dramatic event. Through a door left open by arrogance. By entering a battle without first covering his own household. By being so certain of his own strength that he forgot strength was never his to begin with. The night everything collapsed was a Tuesday in November. Amara had put Daniel to bed at 8:30. Elijah was in his study reviewing his Sunday message when he heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow. Deliberate. Not Daniel's light-footed shuffle. He walked out of the study and found Daniel standing in the center of the hallway under the overhead light, feet flat on the floor, arms at his sides. He was looking directly at his father. His eyes were open. But something was wrong with them. Not the color. Not the shape. The quality of what was looking out through them. Then Daniel spoke. And the voice that came out of that 8-year-old boy's throat was not Daniel's voice. It was layered and low and it said, "You cast us out. But you left the door open." Elijah felt his legs go cold. The voice continued, "You came home proud. You did not cleanse yourself. You did not protect what was yours. You invited us in." Elijah dropped to his knees right there in the hallway. Not because he was overcome. Because in that moment, for the first time in years, he had absolutely nothing to stand on. Every victory. Every testimonial. Every crowd that had cheered his name. None of it was in the room with him. Just him and his son and the truth he had been running from. He called his elders at 11 o'clock that night. He called 2 senior pastors he had not spoken to in years, men he had quietly considered beneath his level. He called them because they were humble in ways he had stopped being. And he told them everything. Every detail. Including the part he had not told anyone, the last word spoken in that room in Rachel's house, the warning he had dismissed. One experienced deliverance minister who spent years in that work eventually arrived at a hard truth, that spiritual warfare requires ongoing accountability, and that the most vulnerable moment for anyone in that work is the moment right after the victory, when the guard is lowest and the pride is highest. Elijah had walked directly into that moment without protection. What followed was 3 days. 3 days of fasting, prayer, repentance, and spiritual covering from people who loved him enough to tell him the truth. Amara held the house together during that time the way she had always held everything together, quietly, without fanfare, from the foundation up. On the 3rd night, during a long prayer session in Daniel's room, the boy woke up. He looked around at the men kneeling by his bed. He looked at his father's face, tear-streaked and exhausted. And he said, in his own voice, his real voice, the one that made Elijah feel like the most important man alive, "Daddy. Are you okay?" Elijah Cross did not preach for 2 months after that night. When he returned to the pulpit, his congregation noticed something had changed. He spoke less about his own victories. He prayed differently. Longer. More carefully. With his eyes open instead of his fists raised. He never told his congregation exactly what had happened in that hallway. But those who knew him well understood that whatever it was, it had made him better. Not weaker. Better. Because some lessons cannot be taught. They can only be survived. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to think about this honestly. If you had been Elijah that night, kneeling in that hallway while your child stared at you with someone else's eyes, what would you have done? Would you have been able to admit the mistake that put your family in that position? And here is the harder question, are there doors in your own life that you have left open because you were too proud to admit you were not as protected as you believed? The most dangerous version of any of us is the one that believes we are untouchable. Because that is exactly the version that something patient is waiting for. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. Tell me how it made you feel. Tell me what you would have done differently than Elijah. Tell me what moment in this story hit you the hardest. Your response means everything to this community. And if you are new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. And before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. Because the next story? About a man who disappeared after praying alone in a forbidden place at midnight? That one will stay with you long after it ends.